Hey guys, happy Friday afternoon. This is becoming a regular thing on a Friday afternoon. Today I wanted to talk about mental health because it's Mental Health Awareness Week, the end of Mental Health Awareness Week. And I've done a couple of posts over on TikTok about mental health. And one of the posts that's been really interesting is kind of prompted how or what is it about dyslexia that impacts our mental health? Now, I need to start by saying I am not an expert or a doctor or a nurse in mental health. But what I do know as a neurodivergent person that has dyslexia and ADHD and an assessor and teacher of people that have dyslexia and a parent of children with dyslexia is there is definitely a link between having dyslexia and it impacting mental health in a negative way. And I want to have a bit of a discussion about that really and kind of share my thoughts on why that might be. And I'm going to start by sharing really quite a personal story that if any of you have read my book, Don't Forget to Smile, you'll know that this is in my book. But when I was in year 11 at school taking my GCSEs, I didn't know I was dyslexic at the time. I didn't get diagnosed until I was 34. But actually, my mental health was in really quite a bad state at that time. And I didn't know why. At the time, it was just put down to being a hormonal teenager. And I now know, when I got my diagnosis and kind of since I've worked through it since, that actually what was happening at that time was I was giving 110%. I was showing up to all of my lessons. I was working as hard as I possibly could. I couldn't be working any harder. Yet that effort was not equaling my attainment. So, my predicted grades for GCSEs were okay, but they were not reflective of the effort that I was putting in. And at the time, I couldn't quite get my head around why that effort wasn't equaling the attainment. And the narrative and the voice I had in my head was that I'm not very clever. I'm not working hard enough. I need to work harder if I need to get A's. Like this is my fault. I now know that actually dyslexia was the reason why, undiagnosed, unsupported dyslexia was the reason why I was putting all of that effort in and I wasn't getting the grades reflective of that effort because I wasn't being taught in a way that supported dyslexia, but also it's very unlikely that I was ever going to get A's actually when I look at it, because I don't write in the way that you need to write academically to be able to get A's. It would have taken an awful lot of work for that to have happened. And what happened is my confidence and my self-esteem became incredibly low. I started to refer to myself as stupid. I started to really doubt my ability. And as a result, I did become quite depressed as a teenager because I was pushing so hard to make progress and against my brain, and I didn't realize it, that it actually had a really negative impact on my emotional well-being and my mental health. Now, I had a small amount so I ended up being prescribed antidepressants actually as a teenager. And if you want to know the rest, you can read the book. I'm not actually going to talk about that openly on here because it feels just too personal to actually say out loud. But, there was a really tough point in my life where I was really, really struggling and I just didn't want to be here anymore as a teenager. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because nobody would have made the connection at the time that was related to dyslexia because I didn't have a diagnosis. But so many of the young people that I assess and that I work with and the adults that I work with later on have got low confidence and self-esteem, low self-belief. They don't trust themselves because of the experience that they had at school where their effort wasn't equaling their attainment. So therefore, the narrative that they begin to build in their head is that they're not very clever. not good at anything. And that kind of leads to depression. But the other thing that it can sometimes lead to is really high levels of anxiety. So just last week, I assessed a student actually who is kind of living on the edge of their nerves, a lower sixth student who is working so hard to keep up, but isn't often quite understanding what's going on. So they're absolutely terrified that they're going to be asked a question in class that they're not going to be able to answer. But they've got this real will to want to kind of push themselves. And what's happening is they're becoming very anxious as a result. The other place that anxiety is coming from is the speed that they're having to work. So their work speed is an awful lot slower than the rest of the peers in the class. It just so happens that they're in a class with peers that read things really quickly. So there's a sense of kind of embarrassment and shame that they're not being able to keep up with the class expectation. So, there's anxiety coming from that point. And then there's the anxiety of the deadlines of, tasks, the written tasks are taking such a long time to produce and create, that is really stressful for that young person. And it's actually creating low-level anxiety that is there all the time. And this low-level anxiety and this low confidence and self-esteem, they kind of all dovetail in together, don't they? And they eventually, if they are not supported, will manifest itself in terms of weak mental health. It can't not impact and make a difference to your mental health. And I think this story is sadly so true for so many people with dyslexia who are diagnosed and who are not diagnosed with dyslexia in school, because they don't understand where their struggles are coming from. And we tend to think of supporting dyslexia, and schools put interventions in to support reading and spelling. And I get that, because that's potentially the bit that they're interested in. But for me, I truly believe if we want to support dyslexia positively, we need to be supporting the literacy side, but we also need to be developing the emotional well-being and the confidence and self-esteem side to be proactive, so it doesn't get to the point where it does manifest in poor mental health, where people feel so depressed because they've put so much effort into something that it isn't equaling their attainment, or they're so anxious that they're not going to get something right. They're worried about going into a classroom and putting their hand up because of the shame and the embarrassment. And I think the thing with dyslexia as well is we're often very driven. We're intelligent people who are really driven to be as successful as we possibly can be. We're actually quite good at pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone. But I think what potentially happens as a result of being pushed out of our comfort zones is that anxiety, but also that fear of failure, which again can feed into weak mental health. My story is even more interesting, because I didn't actually get my diagnosis until I was 34, by which point I'd had all 3 of my children. And whilst from the age of 28, I kind of suspected I was dyslexic, I didn't have that formal diagnosis. And I was working so hard to mask and compensate. So again, masking, compensation, over delivery, all of these things create a low level anxiety. I was working so hard to keep my dyslexia hidden that with every child that came along, it became a bit more difficult to manage, because my strategies were spread thinner and thinner and thinner. And I would say my main strategy once I hit adulthood, so I think coping with dyslexia in adulthood is very different to coping with it when you're at school. And my main strategy once I went into adulthood really was to make myself as invisible as possible. So I would go to work. I had a really small, close network of friends, which is still the same now, really. I wasn't a great socializer, simply because I just didn't have the energy to be able to socialize. So adulthood, my real strategy was kind of being invisible, kind of spending a long time at home, kind of recovering from the burnout or kind of recovering from the day or massively overcompensating. And with every child that came along, I became a little bit more visible. So, once one started school or preschool or whatever, you've got parents' evenings, you've got days that you have to remember that are non-uniform. There is a huge strain on working memory. On that cognitive load. And for me, with every child that came along, I became more and more visible, and it became more and more difficult for me to use the strategies that I had been using to kind of cope and keep my dyslexia hidden. And with that went the time that I was actually regulating my anxiety. So, for example, one of the things I really do to help regulate my anxiety and, that makes me feel good is I used to sing in a band. I went to a dance class once a week. I would just go for walks on my own or be in the car on my own. Like I always remember when I worked in school, that drive home from school to the childminders was like so important, because literally I would put the music on and just zone out and listen to music that I really loved, and that would kind of lower my anxiety a bit. But with every child that came along, it became more and more difficult to kind of keep that anxiety hidden. And eventually, when my youngest was about 6 months old, I did end up, having to go to the doctors and seek support, because I did feel quite depressed. And I just felt like I couldn't function. And that wasn't particularly for any other reason than dyslexia, and we now know ADHD. I was not managing those things properly. And what had happened was I'd fallen into patterns of behavior that were not proactively supporting my mental health. And actually that bout of counselling did lead to me resigning from my job, and actually setting up my company, because I realised that actually for me, teaching was not going to be a career that was conducive to supporting my children and supporting myself and managing my dyslexia and keeping on top of my mental health. For me, that just wasn't going to work. So there we have it. That's my insight on how I think dyslexia impacts on mental health, and why I think it's really important that we are identifying and supporting people with dyslexia in education, so that we can help them, make them aware of what that profile looks like, so that they can manage it positively. But also why I think it's really important to be supporting the literacy side, but also have some sort of interventions in place to support confidence and self-esteem. And on the last note, when I'm doing a series of videos at the moment, we're answering my most common comments in video form. And one of the most common comments I get from parents is, how can I support my child's dyslexia at home? And the answer is so simple. You just need to boost their confidence and self-esteem. Doing that isn't necessarily as easy. So the reason why I feel like it's the most important thing that parents can do is, even if you are an identified dyslexic and your school has got some kind of support in place, the likelihood is you're going to be experiencing regular failure at school on a daily basis. Your effort is not going to equal your attainment. If I look at my 3 children and what's happened to them recently, one in the workplace and two at school, often their effort doesn't equal their attainment. So what we want to be doing outside of school, outside of work, is experiencing success that balances out that kind of negative. And I talk quite a lot in my parent talks about a virtual self-esteem bucket, that actually, if as parents we can fill that, in our time with our children, we can keep that self-esteem bucket filled to the point of overflowing, then when it comes to going to school, they've got some reserves in there to be resilient, to kind of keep them going. They'll never kind of quite hit rock bottom if we can keep kind of topping it up. So for me, that is the key and most important thing that parents can do, is put their child in the way of success as many times as possible. And that doesn't necessarily need to be through literacy skill. Actually sometimes giving them more of the same thing is not helpful. My son will tell you that for the 6 months that I tried to support him with his literacy, we it was just actually exacerbating it was making his self-esteem lower, and it was making him anxious. So around in year 1, I guess, I really panicked, still wasn't writing his name, still wasn't reading. And I tried to kind of like, because I knew I had the skills, I tried really hard to support him. But actually what happened was I actually ended up overcompensating and passing my anxiety onto him. And it wasn't helping his confidence and self-esteem. And I learned quite early on that if I wanted to support him, it needed to be in a different way. It needed to be not by doing the literacy skill with him. It needed to be by filling his self-esteem bucket up. And I am super excited. It is still here, the kids course. It's getting closer. It's getting closer. I'm hoping that it might be released by half term, but we'll have to wait and see. I'm genuinely think that the key thing we can do as parents to support our children's dyslexia is kind of boost their confidence and self-esteem and kind of minimize the impact of dyslexia on our mental health, I guess. So there we go. I've waffled again for 16 minutes. I hope you found this to be interesting. Please do let me know your thoughts underneath. Because I'd love to know your insight on whether you think dyslexia kind of does have a direct link or a direct impact to weaker mental health and emotional well-being. So yeah, if not, thank you for watching and have a really great weekend.